What I'm about to show you is going to rewrite what you think you know about your family. And I need you to watch this entire video because the piece that's going to hit you hardest is not at the beginning, it's not in the middle, it's at the end. If you have a Spanish last name, if your family is from the American Southwest, from Mexico, from Texas, from New Mexico, if you have ever gotten a DNA result that showed something you couldn't explain, stay right here. Because in the next few minutes, a 500-year-old secret that your own ancestors worked incredibly hard to keep is about to come apart. Do you actually know who your family is? Not their names, not where they were born, not what country they came from, or what language they spoke, or what religion they practiced. I mean, do you actually know the full story? Because most people, when they think about their family history, are working from a version of events that was carefully edited before it reached them. Not by malice, not by conspiracy, but by survival, by necessity, by the very human instinct to protect the people you love from a world that wants to destroy them. The story I'm going to tell you today is about exactly that. It is a story about a group of people who were given an impossible choice, who found a third option that nobody anticipated, and who then executed that option so flawlessly across so many generations, across an entire ocean, that by the time their plan reached its final stage, even they had forgotten they were running it. Here is why I need you to stay until the very end of this video. Not because I'm going to hit you with a dramatic twist in the last 5 minutes, though what I'm going to tell you near the end of this will genuinely change how some of you see your own family. I need you to stay because this story only makes sense if you hear all of it. The beginning explains the middle explains the end, and the end is going to explain something that millions of Americans have been confused about for years, something sitting in their DNA results that nobody ever properly explained to them. This story is personally relevant to an estimated 10 to 15 million Americans right now, maybe more. Most of them have no idea. Some of them have gotten DNA results that confuse them deeply and never had a satisfying explanation for what they were looking at. Some of them grew up with strange family traditions that nobody could ever quite account for. Some of them have last names like Garcia or Martinez or Perez or De Leon and have always assumed those names were simply Spanish, the way that millions of Spanish names are simply Spanish, nothing more complicated than that. Those people are going to want to watch this to the very end, because by the time we finish, something is going to click into place for some of you that has never clicked before. And I want to warn you now that when it does, it is going to hit very hard. For everyone else, you are about to encounter one of the most sophisticated survival operations in the entire history of human civilization. A 500-year deception so complete, so thorough, so biologically embedded, that modern genetic science is only now capable of unraveling it. We are talking about people who hid an identity so deeply that they hid it from their own grandchildren, who buried a truth so carefully that the burial itself became the new truth. And here's the part that I think is the most remarkable thing about this entire story, the thing that I want you to hold in your mind as we go through all of this. The plan worked. Whatever else you want to say about it, whatever questions it raises, whatever complicated feelings it generates, the plan worked. The people who set it in motion 500 years ago succeeded. Their bloodline survived. It survived an empire, an inquisition, an ocean crossing, centuries of isolation, and 500 years of deliberate forgetting. And it survived so completely that right now, there are millions of Americans carrying this genetic signature inside their cells, going about their daily lives, completely unaware that they are the living proof of one of history's greatest escape acts. Let's go back to where this started. And I mean really back, not just to 1492, though we will get there. I want you to understand the world that existed before 1492, because without that context, the scale of what happened doesn't fully land. For roughly 1,000 years before 1492, the Iberian Peninsula, which is what we now call Spain and Portugal, was one of the most culturally and intellectually sophisticated places on Earth. This was not a simple monoculture. It was a layered, complex, sometimes violent, sometimes remarkably tolerant coexistence of three major civilizations: Christian kingdoms in the north, Muslim caliphates in the south, the remnants of a Moorish conquest that had begun in 711 AD, and woven through all of it, one of the largest, most established, most intellectually prominent Jewish communities in the entire world. The Jews of Spain did not think of themselves as immigrants or refugees or a tolerated minority. They had been in Iberia for over 1,000 years. Some scholars argue they had been there since the time of the Roman Empire. They called it Sepharad, the Hebrew word for Spain. This was not a place they were passing through. This was home, and they had built extraordinary things there. The Jewish communities of Toledo, Cordoba, Seville, and Barcelona produced philosophers, physicians, astronomers, poets, and mathematicians whose work shaped the intellectual history of the entire Western world. Maimonides, arguably the most influential Jewish thinker of the medieval period, was born in Cordoba. The Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism, was written in Castile in the 13th century. Jewish scholars translated Greek and Arabic scientific texts into Latin, making them available to Christian European scholars who would otherwise have had no access to them. The intellectual transmission that eventually fueled the Renaissance passed partly through the hands of Spanish Jews. And beyond the famous scholars, there was a vast, thriving middle layer of merchants, craftsmen, tax collectors, court physicians, and ordinary people who had built their lives and their communities into the fabric of Spanish society over 1,000 years. In 1492, all of that ended. On March 31st of that year, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the same monarchs who funded Columbus's voyage, signed the Alhambra Decree. The edict gave every Jewish person living in Spain 4 months to make a choice: convert to Catholicism, leave Spain permanently, forfeiting all property and taking only what you could carry, or die. I want you to sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 800,000 Jews were affected by this decree. The range is wide because the records are incomplete and disputed, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. We're talking about a community that had existed in that land for 1,000 years, being given 4 months to cease to exist. Some left. They sailed to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to the Netherlands, to anywhere that would take them. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II famously welcomed the Spanish Jews with open arms, reportedly saying that the Spanish king was impoverishing his own country while enriching the Ottomans. Those communities survive to this day. The Ladino language, a form of medieval Spanish preserved in Jewish communities in Turkey and Greece and Israel, is a direct artifact of that expulsion. There are elderly people alive today in Istanbul and Thessaloniki and Tel Aviv whose families have spoken a form of 15th century Spanish for 500 years, preserved like a linguistic fossil, because their ancestors refused to forget where they came from. But tens of thousands of Jews did not leave. They could not leave, or they chose not to leave, or they were unable to bear the idea of abandoning a home their family had occupied for 40 generations. And so they converted. They were baptized. They took Christian names. They went to Mass. They became, on paper and in public, Catholic. The Church and the Crown had a name for them: Conversos, converts. And initially, at least in theory, the conversion was supposed to be accepted as genuine. A baptized Jew was a Christian. That was the theology. That was the official position. But the Spanish Inquisition, which had been established in 1478 under the same Ferdinand and Isabella, was not operating on pure theology. It was operating on paranoia and politics, and the very rational suspicion that a community of hundreds of thousands of people does not abandon a 1,000-year-old religious and cultural identity because a priest poured water on their heads. The Inquisition had a specific term for conversos who had converted publicly but were suspected of continuing to practice Judaism in private. They called them marranos. The word is a Spanish pejorative. It means pigs. It was not a neutral bureaucratic category. It was a slur designed to dehumanize people who were already terrified. And the Inquisition hunted them systematically, methodically, and with the full coercive power of the Spanish state and the Catholic Church combined. Here is how the surveillance actually worked, because I think most people have a vague sense of the Inquisition as a historical evil without fully understanding the mechanism. And the mechanism is what makes the response to it so extraordinary. Inquisition officials would arrive in a town and announce a grace period during which anyone who confessed their sins voluntarily would receive lighter punishment. This sounds almost reasonable until you understand what came next. The same announcement that offered mercy to the self-confessing also obligated every citizen to report anyone they suspected of practicing Judaism in secret. Not to report them was itself a sin. Your neighbors were now formally required, under threat of religious penalty, to watch you and report anything suspicious. What counted as suspicious? Almost anything that distinguished your household from standard Catholic practice. If your neighbor noticed that you lit candles on Friday evening before sundown, that was suspicious. If your household didn't cook on Saturdays, that was suspicious. If you were seen to avoid pork or shellfish, that was suspicious. If you were observed washing your hands before meals in a particular way, that was suspicious. If the mirrors in your house were covered after a family member died, that was suspicious. If you were seen to sweep the floor toward the center of the room rather than toward the door, that was suspicious. I want you to notice something about that list. Every single item on it is a normal, ordinary domestic behavior. The Inquisition had essentially made the interior of your home a surveillance zone and turned your neighbors into informants, and the penalties for being found guilty were not abstract. They ranged from confiscation of property to imprisonment to torture to being burned alive in a public spectacle called an auto da fe, which translates, with a particular kind of historical irony, to act of faith. An auto da fe was not a private punishment. It was a public event. There were processions, officials in ceremonial robes, crowds of spectators. The condemned were paraded through the streets. Those who recanted at the last moment might be strangled before being burned, a mercy of sorts. Those who did not recant were burned alive. These events happened regularly in Spanish cities for over 300 years. The last official auto da fe in Spain occurred in 1826, which means this institution was operational for longer than the United States has existed as a country. So now put yourself in the position of a Converso family in, say, 1510. You have converted. You are attending Mass. You are doing everything that is visibly required of you. But in the privacy of your own home, you are still observing the Sabbath, still following the dietary laws, still lighting the candles, still saying the old prayers quietly after dark. You know that your neighbors are watching. You know that a single denunciation can bring the Inquisition to your door. You know that if your children say the wrong thing at school, or if a servant sees something they shouldn't, your entire family can be destroyed. What do? You begin a process that I can only describe as the most sophisticated long-term identity management operation ever undertaken by a civilian population. You start stripping context from your practices. You keep the behavior, but you remove the explanation. You stop telling your children that lighting candles on Friday is a Jewish practice because if your children know that, they might accidentally reveal it. Instead, you tell them it's just something the family does, a tradition, something grandmother always did. You don't know exactly why, it's just how things are done in this family. Over one generation, the practice becomes cultural rather than religious. Over 2 generations, the origin is completely obscured. Over 3 generations, the family genuinely does not know why they do it. They just do it. It's tradition. It's what we've always done. And here's the part that I think is genuinely profound, the part that elevates this from a historical tragedy to something that approaches the miraculous. The specific practices that survived this stripping process were not random. They were the practices most deeply embedded in daily domestic life, the ones performed most regularly, most automatically, most instinctively. The ones that a grandmother would pass to a granddaughter, not through explicit instruction, but through physical demonstration, through repetition, through the simple act of living alongside each other day after day. This is not how religions usually transmit themselves. Religions usually transmit through language, through text, through explicit teaching, through communal worship. Strip all of that away, and most religious practice disappears within a generation or two. But these practices were so deeply woven into the rhythms of daily life, into how you swept the floor and what you cooked and when you lit candles and what you did when someone died, that they persisted without the linguistic and theological framework that originally gave them meaning. The culture forgot, the behavior remembered. And before we go any further into what happened next, I want to pause here for just a second. Because if you are finding this as extraordinary as I do, if this kind of deep buried history is what you want more of, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Not at the end of the video, right now. Because this channel is entirely dedicated to exactly this kind of story. The histories that didn't make it into your textbooks, the ancestries that got buried so deep that even the people carrying them forgot. The DNA results that are rewriting what millions of Americans think they know about where they came from. We have more of these stories coming, and if you are not subscribed, you're going to miss them. Hit subscribe. Do it now. And then come right back because we are just getting to the part where this story crosses an ocean. Now let's talk about why the Americas became the endpoint of this story. Because this is the part that explains why what started as a Spanish crisis became an American genetic mystery. As the 16th century progressed and the Inquisition's reach extended and intensified, the crypto-Jewish families who had managed to survive in Spain and in early colonial Mexico began to look for a solution that wasn't just hiding better. They needed distance. They needed to be somewhere that the institutional apparatus of the Inquisition simply could not reach effectively. The Spanish colonial frontier offered exactly that. The Americas were vast. The church's administrative presence was thin and stretched. The further you pushed from the colonial centers, the less oversight there was. The Inquisition had a formal presence in Mexico City, in Lima, in Cartagena, but in the remote mountain valleys of what is now New Mexico, in the isolated ranching communities of South Texas, in the frontier territories of Nuevo Leon, a priest might visit your village twice a year. The eyes of the institution were simply not there. And so Converso families, in significant numbers, deliberately chose to settle on the edge of the map. The historian Seymour Liebman documented this in extensive detail in the 1970s, tracing families from their origins in Spain through their appearance in Inquisition records in Mexico City to their eventual settlement in frontier communities. The scholar Francis Cartonen identified specific family names in colonial New Mexico that can be traced genealogically to prominent Jewish families in Spain. Historian Stanley Hordes, who served as New Mexico state historian, spent years interviewing families in the Southwest who had no conscious knowledge of Jewish ancestry, but who practiced traditions that were unambiguously Jewish in origin. His book on the subject, published in 2005, documented these findings in rigorous academic detail. The communities Hordes studied were living in exactly the places you would predict crypto-Jewish families to have settled. Remote, insular, tight-knit. Families that had married almost exclusively within their own communities for generations, not out of prejudice necessarily, but out of the same protective insularity that had kept them alive in Spain. Communities that were nominally Catholic, but that had embedded in their domestic culture a set of practices that any rabbi would immediately recognize. Now here is where I want to slow down and spend some real time, because this is the section that is going to hit differently for some of you than anything else in this video. I want to walk through the ghost traditions, the specific practices that survived the stripping process, the behaviors that persisted across 500 years and an ocean crossing and centuries of genuine Catholic faith, preserved not by conscious intention, but by the sheer gravitational pull of domestic habit. Imagine you are a woman living in a small village in northern New Mexico in the year 1820. Your family has been in this region for 6 or 7 generations. You are Catholic. You have always been Catholic. As far as you know, your family has always been Catholic, going back further than anyone can remember. Every Friday evening before the sun goes down, you light 2 candles. Your mother did this. Your grandmother did this. Her mother did this before her. You don't know why exactly. When you asked as a child, your grandmother said it was just what the women in the family do. It's tradition. Your family does not eat pork. Your grandmother always said it made her stomach hurt. Her mother said the same thing. You have grown up in a household where pork simply isn't served, and you have never thought to question it beyond accepting the explanation that your family has a sensitivity to it. When someone in your family dies, you cover all the mirrors in the house with cloth. You have done this your whole life. When you asked about it as a child, your grandfather just said it was respect for the dead. It's what you do. When you sweep the floor, you sweep the dirt toward the center of the room. You pick it up from there. You have never in your life swept dirt toward the front door and out of the house. It simply isn't how you sweep. It's how your mother swept and how her mother swept. Now, each of those 4 practices has a direct, specific, documented origin in Jewish religious law and tradition. Lighting 2 candles on Friday evening before sundown is the traditional opening of the Jewish Sabbath. It is performed by the woman of the household. It has been performed this way for thousands of years. It is one of the most fundamental and widely observed rituals in Judaism. The prohibition on pork is one of the most central dietary laws in the Torah, codified in the book of Leviticus. It is not a Catholic practice. There is no Catholic prohibition on pork. A family that avoids pork and explains it as a stomach sensitivity across 7 generations is not describing a digestive condition. They are describing a religious dietary law whose origin has been forgotten. Covering the mirrors during mourning is a Jewish practice associated with the 7-day mourning period called Shiva. The practice has several traditional explanations, rooted in Jewish theology and philosophy. It is not a standard Catholic mourning practice. Sweeping toward the center of the room, rather than toward the door, has its roots in avoiding any appearance of performing conspicuous labor on the Sabbath. Sweeping out the front door was considered a more visible, more public act. Sweeping toward the center and collecting from there was a way of performing necessary household work while minimizing visibility. These are not vague cultural similarities. They are not the kind of parallel practices that might arise independently in different cultures through coincidence. They are specific. They are documented. They are Jewish. And they survived intact, stripped of their explanations, but not their forms, across 500 years and an ocean crossing, inside families who had genuinely no idea what they were preserving. Historian Stanley Hordes, in his research across New Mexico, encountered family after family who described these exact practices. People who had never heard the word Sephardic, people whose families had been Catholic for as far back as living memory extended. People who, when Hordes described the Jewish origins of their family traditions, sat in silence for a long moment before saying something like, "So that's why we did that." That response, "So that's why we did that," is one of the most historically significant sentences I can imagine. It is the sound of 500 years of forgetting suddenly reversing itself. And then the DNA started coming. The same insularity that allowed these families to preserve their practices also preserved their genetics with unusual fidelity. When a small, genetically distinct population reproduces largely within itself over many generations, specific genetic variants that are common in that founding population become concentrated over time. Geneticists call this the founder effect. It is the same phenomenon that makes certain genetic diseases more prevalent in isolated populations. And it is the same phenomenon that makes Sephardic Jewish ancestry detectable in descendants 500 years after the original community began to scatter. The genetic signature of Sephardic Jews is unusually distinct for a reason that predates the Inquisition. Jewish communities historically maintained strict endogamy, marrying within the community, for religious and cultural reasons for centuries before 1492. By the time of the Alhambra decree, Sephardic Jews had developed one of the most genetically coherent population signatures in all of Europe. When the Converso families established new isolated communities in the Americas and continued to marry within their tight-knit groups for generation after generation, they preserved and concentrated that signature even further. Modern consumer DNA testing is built on reference databases assembled from thousands of verified samples from known populations around the world. When 23andMe, or Ancestry DNA, identifies Sephardic Jewish ancestry in your results, they are not making an educated guess based on a couple of data points. They are comparing hundreds of thousands of genetic positions in your DNA against a reference population of verified Sephardic Jewish samples, and identifying a statistically significant match across a massive number of genetic markers simultaneously. A result of 3% or 5% or 8% Sephardic Jewish ancestry is not noise in the data. It is a clear, specific, reproducible signal. A study published in 2018 in the American Journal of Human Genetics analyzed DNA from communities across the American Southwest and northern Mexico and found Sephardic Jewish genetic markers at rates that were substantially higher than background levels in the general Spanish-descended population. The distribution of these markers correlated strongly with communities that had documented historical ties to Converso settlement. The DNA and the historical record were pointing at exactly the same people. The genetics confirmed what the historians and the anthropologists had been arguing for decades, based on documentary evidence and oral tradition. What this means practically is that there are millions of Americans, primarily but not exclusively in Hispanic communities with roots in the Southwest, who are carrying a genetic inheritance they know nothing about. Families who have been genuinely, sincerely Catholic for 500 years. Families whose grandparents would be bewildered by this information. Families who grew up lighting candles on Friday evenings and avoiding pork and covering mirrors when someone died and have never once connected any of those practices to anything other than family tradition. Now I want to bring this to the place where it actually lives, which is not in a history book or a genetics paper, but in a kitchen, in a living room, in a family gathering where someone asks why we always do this and nobody has a satisfying answer. Because I think the most important thing to understand about this story is not the historical machinery that produced it, as extraordinary as that machinery is. The most important thing is what it means about the people who made it possible. The original Conversos, the families who converted in 1492 and began the long process of hiding, made a decision that I think is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend from the outside. They decided to sacrifice their conscious identity in order to preserve their biological one. They understood, at some level, that they could not keep both. That keeping the conscious identity, the open practice, the explicit faith, would eventually get them killed and end the line completely. So they made the only trade that was available to them. They gave up the right to be known in exchange for the right to continue existing. They gave up the ability to say openly what they were. They gave up the prayers said in the language their grandparents had spoken. They gave up the communal worship, the shared identity, the ability to look their neighbor in the eye and say, "This is who I am." They buried all of that so deeply that their own grandchildren couldn't find it. And in exchange, the bloodline continued. The DNA continued. The specific domestic habits that carried the ghost of their identity continued, stripped of meaning but intact in form, passed from grandmother to granddaughter across 2 centuries of genuine forgetting, until the forgetting was so complete that nobody living could remember what had been forgotten. And then the DNA tests came. And the databases got built, and suddenly the silence of 500 years started speaking again. Think about what that actually means. The Inquisition was one of the most powerful and sustained institutional efforts in the recorded history of Western civilization to identify and destroy a specific group of people. It had the full resources of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. It had the force of law, the apparatus of surveillance, the willingness to use torture and public execution, and 300 years of continuous operation. It was specifically and explicitly designed to find the crypto-Jews and eliminate them. It failed, not because of a military campaign, not because of a political revolution, not because someone organized a resistance movement or won a battle or appealed to a higher authority. It failed because a group of ordinary families, merchants and farmers and craftspeople and physicians, found a way to become invisible so completely that the most powerful surveillance apparatus of their era could not find them. They outmaneuvered an empire, not through strength, but through silence, not through confrontation, but through transformation. And the proof that they succeeded is sitting in a database right now. The proof is loading on laptops and phones and homes across the American Southwest. The proof is the confused look on the face of a third-generation New Mexican woman who just got her DNA results and is staring at a percentage she does not understand. The proof is the moment when someone reads this and suddenly realizes why their grandmother always swept the floor toward the center of the room. They survived. They survived so thoroughly and so quietly that they are still surprising their own descendants 5 centuries after they first disappeared. If you have made it this far into this video and you're feeling what I think you might be feeling right now, that specific combination of historical vertigo and personal recognition that comes when a story this large suddenly becomes intimate, then you already understand why this channel exists. This is what we do here. We go into the deep history. We find the stories that didn't make it into the official version. We look at the DNA and the documents and the ghost traditions, and we try to reconstruct what actually happened to the people who came before us. There are more stories like this one. I promise you there are more. And if you are not subscribed to this channel, you are going to miss them. So do it right now before you do anything else. Before you scroll to the comments, before you click on anything else, hit subscribe. Because the next story is already in production, and it is going to hit just as hard as this one, possibly harder. And I do not want you to miss it. Subscribed? Good. Now go to the comments. Because here is what I need from you. Tell me, does your family have any of these traditions? The Friday candles? The covered mirrors? The pork avoidance with no explanation that anyone could ever fully account for? The particular way of sweeping toward the center? Have you gotten a DNA result with a Sephardic Jewish percentage that confused you until right now? Tell me in the comments. I read them. I respond to them. And I can tell you from experience that the comment section on videos like this one becomes something remarkable because what happens is that people start recognizing each other. Someone from Texas posts about their grandmother's candles. Someone from New Mexico responds that their family did the exact same thing. Someone from northern Mexico says their family covered the mirrors and always wondered why. And suddenly these people who have been carrying the same quiet, inexplicable traditions their entire lives, completely alone with their confusion, find each other in the comment section of a YouTube video. That is not nothing. That is actually something quite significant. That is 500 years of enforced silence starting to end. Your grandmother didn't lie to you. She told you the truth as she knew it. The truth she knew was built on several hundred years of very careful, very loving forgetting. But underneath that forgetting, underneath the Catholic faith and the Spanish names and the generations of genuine devotion, there was something older, something that crossed an ocean in the belly of a wooden ship and pushed to the very edge of a frontier and embedded itself so deeply into the way a woman swept a floor and lit candles before sundown that no empire and no inquisition and no amount of time could reach it. That something is in the DNA test. It's in the ghost traditions. It's in your family. And now finally, you know what it is. See you in the next one.